Hey guys, thanks so much for being here, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the best time slot. The time slot right after the coffee break where you're all artificially perked up and attentive. I'm going to be talking to you today about some weird stuff, as I usually do. A little background about myself. I'm 30 years old, I live in Tel Aviv. I run an international music blog, and I also work for a high-tech company called LivePerson, where I run the developers community. But I've also been reading and thinking and writing about science fiction for 15, 16 years now. I've spoken about the topic in conferences like Republica in Berlin and in other places, and I mostly like to talk about the intersection between science fiction, social critique, power relationships, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So, the subject line of my talk has changed a bit. My talks are always these metamorphosing monsters until now, when I give them and they get their final form. And it's called Unraveling the Timeline, Data Design, the Future, and Hidden Discourse. So there are three terms in the subtitle which we need to unpack before we can move forward. Data design is the first one, and that's the one I have to say the least about, because you all should know approximately what we're talking about. When we talk about data design, we're speaking about the tools and interfaces which we use to make our data more accessible. It can be data about products, as we've seen here in the last session. It can be data about objects. It can be data about people. Anything that we have statistics and information about, we can design. We're going to skip over the future, because that's the most complex term, and talk about hidden discourse. So discourse is kind of a buzzword, doesn't mean anything anymore. So I'll give you a brief definition. Discourse is the language, knowledge, and tools which we use to talk about a field of expertise. So for example, plumbers have plumber discourse, and philosophers have philosophy discourse, and UX designers have UX discourse. It's a blanket term for all the little terms and languages and ideas that we use when we talk about the subject. And what is hidden discourse? So discourse about plumbing, or about cars, or about philosophy is obvious. We've grown used to talking about these discourses. When I tell you that shop workers have their own discourse, you don't bat an eyelid. Obviously, they have a discourse. But there are hidden discourses around us, which we don't think about in the day-to-day. For example, there's a huge hidden discourse in this room, and it is the discourse of how we sit in a lecture, and how I give the lecture. There are terms and little codes of action which make up this discourse. For example, you're sitting, I'm standing. I shouldn't say rude words while I'm talking in such a formal setting. You shouldn't interrupt me. And all these little rules and terms are the discourse that is going on between us. But it's hidden. We don't think about it. Up until the moment that I told you about it, it was underneath our conversation. And that's what interests me, taking these hidden discourses and looking at them, and asking the question, what can we say about this discourse, and what does the discourse say about us? So now, the future. The future, presenting the future. The future is super complicated because it is everything. And because it is super complicated, and because it makes up every single moment of our lives, we're constantly thinking about the future. We're constantly thinking about what comes next, and making up tools to deal with it. The fact that the future is so undefinable, that it is so amorphous and vague, makes us sad. Like the famous scene from Doctor Who, a science fiction show which obviously deals with the future. Doctor Who is a time-traveling alien. And in one of the most famous quotes from the show, someone asks the Doctor, what is time? What is the future and the past and the present? And he famously says something, it doesn't matter if you quote it exactly, because that's the whole point. It's like a timey, wimey kind of thing. It's this blob of time and actions. And even the universe's most renowned time traveler can't give a definite definition of what time is. And it makes us sad. And when we're sad, we react. We use our tools to address this pain point. We can't live with this neurosis, with this psychological pain of not being able to define the future. So we start to bring in all sorts of tools. In essence, we try to square the circle. We try to do the impossible and define that which lacks definition. We cannot leave the future undefined. We can't handle that big old void hanging around our heads. So we bring in all these tools to define, arrange, and compile. What do I mean by that? By define, we give the future units of measurement, definitions, seconds, minutes, months, years, seasons, holidays, breaks, times when we are angry, times when we are sad. We collect bullet journals. We use timelines. We use all these tools to define the future. And then we arrange it. We have column A and column B and column C and column D, and we move tasks from one to the other, and we give a timeline, which is a very clear arrangement of where the future is going. And then we compile. We don't just keep these bullet journals to ourselves. Sorry for hanging on that example. It's just amazing. That was the talk before me. It's perfect. Those bullet journals aren't really written for the drawer. They're written for a community. It's shared online. We write them in languages that others can understand. We seek uniformity. We seek compilation. We don't just want our definition of the future to live inside our minds and die with us. We want a shared definition that we can communicate. One of the best tools that we use to do all these things, to define, arrange, and compile the future, is the timeline. You all know the timeline. It's become ubiquitous in our modern day. We use it to visualize the future, to visualize our week, to visualize tasks, anything which has a linear progression. And obviously, when we come to literature and culture and movies and science fiction, we use the timeline as well. It is a very simple and easy tool to customize to our needs. So for example, warning, this timeline is terrible. You designers, you're gonna have a fit. This is a timeline of all science fiction movies released in the last, 30 years, and the dates in which they take place. So this is when the movies were released. And these arcs show you where their story takes place. Now this timeline makes absolutely no sense. Its scale is differing. This is a long, long time ago in a galaxy far away. This is a long time ago on Earth. And this is our modern day and when the movies were released. Why is this on one line? I have no idea. It's a terrible timeline. But what it shows us is that we are squaring the circle, even when it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to put this kind of thing on a timeline. You could have had a chart, you could have had a cloud, you could have had a million other things. We really, really like this linear thing, this timeline. It gives us a sense of security. I know where things are. Okay, this is the original Star Wars trilogy, and this is, what the hell is this? Planet of the Apes, and this is the Time Machine, the original story, and then Primer is in here, and Back to the Future, and all these guys. Even though this timeline doesn't make a lot of sense, it gives us the sense that we know what's going on. At least we put it on a graph. Now this is a meta timeline, right? It shows you when the movies were released. But we can also try to make sense of the internal timeline of the tales being told. This is from a famous webcomics called XKCD, one of the first webcomics, and it's an effort to make sense of the linear narrative of fantasy and science fiction. So this is a bit more complex and a bit more subtle. It's not just a linear progression from left to right, from inception to terminus. It also shows progression, and it also shows characteristics of the narrative timelines. For example, these guys are the orcs. That's why they're black, because they're bad, and black is bad. That's just how we think about it. And these guys are the hobbits, and this is when they go into the mine, and how the Fellowship of the Ring splits up. This is where the Fellowship splits up, right? And it's a bit more complex, but still, did this help you to understand Lord of the Rings? Like if you had this at home, obviously now you have like 10 seconds, but if I gave you this at home, and you had an hour and a half to study this, would it tell you what happened in Lord of the Rings? Not really. But still, this is one of the most popular pages on XKCD, a site which sees 7 million hits per month, last time I checked. It might be more by now. One of the most popular webcomics in the world. This is one of the most popular strips. People love this. There are posters and shirts and plushy pillows of this design. Even though it doesn't really tell you anything about the movie. Same thing for Star Wars. And down here in the corner, you have an even worse example. This is Primer. Who's seen Primer? Put your hands up. Okay, everybody go home and see Primer. Now, no, I'm joking. This is an indie time travel movie. It's insanely dark. I won't say anything about it, so I won't spoil it, but it has time travel. And time travel there is really, really, really weird, as you can see from this chart. The very fact that the author of this comics sat down to try and put a movie as complex as Primer on a timeline shows you that squaring the circle mentality. The whole point of Primer is that it confuses you. Is that time travel is not something you can quantify. It's not something you can progress. And yet, not this esoteric guy living in a basement somewhere doing a comics that only 5 people read. One of the most popular people on the internet took the effort to make this timeline. And then we can get even more subtle. This marvelous thing is a timeline of literature. Not science fiction or fantasy, of all of literature. And it's much more subtle. It allows for roots. It allows for things that disappear and then reappear again. And it's very beautiful. It has a really cool quote here as well. You obviously can't read it, and neither can I, so I won't. It has a cool quote here about fantasy. I don't remember exactly how it goes. Science fiction is improbable realities, and fantasy is probable impossibilities, something like that. But the point is that it's still the left to right narrative. It's still the squaring the circle kind of thing, because literature doesn't work like this. It's not that this guy at this point, you have Weird Tales, which is a really important science fiction magazine. It's not that they knew that they were feeding off of pulp, and that was feeding off of Jules Verne, and Frankenstein, all that stuff. This is merely a perspective enforced on these trends after the act. And yet, it tells us things. And here is where hidden discourse comes in. Look at this beautiful thing. This is propaganda. This is a political, ideological propaganda meant to brainwash you. And I'll explain why. Because right here at the root, you have fear and wonder and animism and legend and all these terms that in a deterministic manner, they don't ask you whether it revolves around that. This is what the timeline tells you. This is where science fiction comes from. Do you want to have your own version of things where it doesn't come from these ideas? Too bad. This is the way things work. This is the historical fact of how science fiction grew and how literature grew. That's the hidden discourse. That's where the timeline, the tool, becomes more than just something we use because it's easy, and becomes something we use to make a point. To make a point about something very complicated with very divergent opinions by people. If you ask, the joke about if you put 2 Jews in the room, you get 3 opinions. If you put 2 science fiction writers in the room, you get 55 opinions, and they're on different timelines and they're affecting each other. And they have a dictionary in Elvish for all the different opinions. But the timeline narrows down this discourse into one flow, into one end-to-end. So, what does this have to do with actual science fiction? 2 minutes? Wow, cool. So what does this have to do with science fiction itself? What came first? Did the timeline come first? Or did our propensity to tell stories about timelines come first? And I'm talking about science fiction. Maybe I should give some examples from science fiction. So we don't have much time, as you know. And so I'm going to look at one example, and that is Star Trek. Obviously centered around, this is Captain Catherine Janeway, the best captain, by the way, if anyone asks you. And she is part of the Starfleet, the Federation of Humanity, and they're explorers. They do terrible war crimes while they're exploring. It's a metaphor for American imperialism and all sorts of other things. And there's one episode, because I don't have time, where this guy, Chakotay, by the way, he's a Mexican actor playing a Native American, 90s, wild times. He is the commander, he's the second in command of Voyager, and he meets this guy, Anorax. This guy has a time-traveling ship, which he uses to edit history. And he's looking for the perfect scenario where his people prosper. They messed something up, the empire was destroyed, and now he's trying to make it live again, make Anorax great again, by time travel. And lo and behold, a timeline. This ship that jumps between history, that makes different versions of history, that makes a mess of this timey, wimey, spacey thing, the main display on it is a timeline. It makes absolutely no sense. Where is the linear progression if this ship can jump back and sever these cords and start a new one? And yet, the person who designed this area used the timeline. because of the ubiquity of the tool, because of our inability to think outside this linear progression. So what? So what, you say? We're unable to think outside this linear progression, you've made your point, timelines work, whatever. What does it matter? To that I say, and here, this is where I break the rules and I swell. Shut the fuck up, Chomsky. I'll explain the joke because it should be funny only to me. This is Michel Foucault, prominent French philosopher, the father of postmodernism, even though he didn't think of himself as a postmodernist. And this is from his debate in the 70s with Noam Chomsky, renowned linguist. And what Noam Chomsky says is some things are natural. Some things just are. We are born with our language. We are born with our ideas. It's not about politics. It's not about ideology. To that I say, shut the fuck up. Everything that we do is political. Everything that we do is seen through the perspectives of the tools which we use to represent it. We're not in 1965. We don't still believe in the revolution. We don't believe in ideas that are God-given. We're in 2018. Post-Trump, post-truth, post-fact, post-politics, post-whatever. And in this day and age, it becomes more and more important for us to examine those hidden discourses, to look at our tools in data analysis, in data design, in data visualization, in companies like the one that I work for, and in the company that was presented before, in bullet journals, asking what are these bullet journals telling us about our lives? What are these tools telling us about our politics? And we have to do it because this is where we're at right now. This is an episode from Community show. They mess around with time travel. This guy goes to get pizza. Depending on which guy goes down to get the pizza, different things occur. And this is the darkest timeline. He comes back and everything is messed up. This is where we're at right now. This is the darkest timeline. And one of the reasons that we got here is because we pretended that our tools and our hidden discourses don't affect us. Don't talk to us about what owning a car means or owning a house or what our products do to us. We kept these hidden discourses going so far that we got to where we are right now. Thank you. Questions, right? You can ask in Hebrew as well. I'm just talking in English for all the guests. What the hell just happened?
So I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
So you talked about the future. So how does the future look like then?
Yeah, so
timeline visualization.
Yeah, whenever I talk about science fiction, I get a question about what's coming next. What about the future? So I'll start by saying what I always say, a disclaimer. Nowadays it's popular to call science fiction speculative literature. The important word here is speculative. I'm not forecasting, I'm not foreseeing, I'm not predicting, I'm speculating. Meaning, don't meet me in 10 years and say, hey, you said X, but Y happened. What is the future of timeline visualization? I think that more and more movies like Primer are coming out. The Endless was just released. Lots of science fiction stories are dealing with time travel in more interesting ways. We're looking at a lot of queer science fiction that deals with time travel, race positive, that is written by minorities that deals with time travel. More and more science fiction writers and creators are asking the questions, what are these timelines about and what are we doing with them? So I foresee this field becoming more and more prolific as we go along. You're going to see a lot more time travel movies, a lot more time travel stories, and hopefully they'll have more interesting and weird and intelligent timelines. I know I didn't answer the question. It's fine. Thanks.